The bone-handled pen dug into her numb fingers like a shard of winter frost. She gripped the thick parchment, letting the dying hearthlight blur the ink. Rain battered the heavy glass outside. Inside, the study reeked of wet ash and ancient cedar. The soaked wool of her cloak clung to her spine, draining the last of her body heat. But the true cold radiating through her marrow came from the man across the desk. Kaelin sat entirely motionless behind the mahogany. His amber irises tracked her breathing. He studied her exactly like a rusted blade he intended to melt down for scrap. Zero warmth, just calculated steel. She kept her chin tucked. She hollowed out her ribs, pulling herself inward to make a smaller target. Let him think she was defeated. Make her sign. A shadow detached itself from the far corner. The beta female stepped forward, nostrils flaring. She reeks of gutter runoff. Burn that cloak the second the ink dries. Kaelin raised one massive finger. The beta's jaw snapped shut. The resulting silence tasted like copper and ozone. Elara dragged the heavy iron inkwell closer. She needed this contract. If she bolted back into the storm, the men hunting her would catch her scent. They would unearth the rotting cellar in the slum borders. They would find the 2 starving toddlers buried under her filthy blankets. Her pulse hammered against her throat. Her babies were shivering. Her own flesh was the absolute last currency she possessed to buy them another sunrise. She tightened her grip on the pen. The terms are absolute. Kaelin's deep baritone vibrated right through the floorboards, rattling the thin soles of her boots. You will be fed. You will sleep in the lower quarters. In exchange, you will bleed a viable heir into this bloodline. No marking, no attachment. Do you understand? Her throat closed up. She swallowed hard against the burn, giving a sharp nod. Verbal confirmation. I understand. Her vocal cords rasped, cracking on the syllables. She dug the metal nib into the thick paper. The scratching tore through the dead quiet. She slashed her signature across the bottom line. The specific clauses meant nothing. She was selling her womb to buy a fortress. She placed the pen down. The ink pooled. She belonged to the iron now. Leave us. Kaelin didn't blink. His stare stayed welded to Elara's collarbone. The beta sneered but obeyed. The heavy oak door clicked shut. The iron latch dropped into place, locking Elara inside with the warlord. Oxygen thinned in the room. She locked her knees, bracing for the physical strike. Men in power took what they wanted and shattered what they didn't need. A heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the floorboards. Kaelin stood. He completely eclipsed the dying firelight as he stalked around the mahogany desk. His heavy boots were utterly silent on the woven rugs. He stopped inches from her toes. Every surviving instinct screamed at her to bare her teeth, to bite, to run. She forced her spine rigid, crushing the edges of her wet cloak until her knuckles bleached white. Drop the cloak! A frantic pulse thudded behind her ribs. She lifted her chin, locking her terrified gaze onto his amber irises. I need to inspect my investment. The words lacked any trace of human warmth. Drop it. Her hands shook violently as she reached for the rusted iron clasp at her throat. The wet metal slipped against her frozen thumbs, before finally snapping open. The soaked wool sloughed off her shoulders, hitting the floorboards with a heavy, wet slap. She stood entirely exposed, in a threadbare, decaying dress. Kaelin took one slow, deliberate half-step into her personal space. His gaze dropped to the sharp jut of her collarbone.
The soaked wool struck the floorboards. A jagged spike of pure fury impaled Kaelin's chest. He locked his jaw, keeping his exterior a mask of absolute frost. Directly beneath his skin, however, his wolf thrashed against his ribs. The woman shivering in his study was starving to death. The faded gray fabric literally rotted off her shoulders. The agonizing jut of her collarbones threatened to pierce her translucent skin. Her wrists were brittle, fragile things, ready to snap under the slightest pressure. Her teeth clicked violently together in the quiet room, a total, unmitigated disaster. He clasped his hands behind his back, burying the urge to wrap her in furs. He required ruthlessness. His empire was bleeding out. The nursery sat empty. He carried the suffocating ash of his own barren failure in his lungs every single day. He required a strong, unbreakable vessel to forge an heir. Instead, he had purchased a walking corpse. He tracked his gaze down to her frayed hem. Dried mud and crusted snow caked her bare ankles. How far had she run? What exact nightmare had driven her to sell her body to a warlord? He ruthlessly slaughtered the questions. Pity bred poison. He paid for a transaction. He needed to verify if this shattered creature could survive a winter draft, let alone carry a bloodline. You are malnourished. She violently flinched. She shrank backward, throwing a defensive forearm over her face. She braced for the physical impact of his fist. That flinch struck his sternum like a swung iron mace. His pupils narrowed into sharp slits. Who shattered her? The sheer volume of raw terror rolling off her skin clogged the air. It reeked of sour copper and violent panic, coating the back of his tongue. She lowered her arm a fraction of an inch. Wide, haunted eyes darted toward his face through a curtain of wet hair. He needed to check her for disease. If she harbored blood rot, he would void the contract and throw her back into the storm. Pure logic. He closed the gap in one fluid stride. She gasped, her spine slamming flat against the heavy oak desk. Nowhere to run. Kaelin eclipsed her entirely. He locked his hands securely behind his spine to deny the threat of a strike. But he leaned his massive frame directly over her. He hovered his jaw inches from the pale curve of her neck. He closed his eyes. He dragged a slow, deliberate breath through his nose. He bypassed the stench of damp wool. He ignored the gutter mud and the sharp copper of her terror. He hunted for the sickly sweet decay of infection. The oxygen in the room burned away. The axis of his reality violently snapped. Fresh rain flooded his lungs, and directly beneath it, the sharp, unmistakable bite of crushed pine needles. Kaelin paralyzed. Every muscle fiber seized into solid steel. His heart slammed a violent, agonizing rhythm against his sternum. Impossible. His memory violently tore backward. The dark, anonymous festival. The roaring bonfires. The soft, desperate scrape of a masked woman's fingernails in the shadows. The exact, intoxicating scent that haunted his waking nightmares every single dawn since he walked away. Rain. Crushed pine. His amber eyes snapped open. He stared at the translucent skin pulsing frantically inches from his mouth. The 10-year frost encasing his chest completely fractured. He slowly lifted his chin. He stared directly down into her terrified eyes. He leaned in until his lips nearly brushed her ear. I know exactly who you are.
The scent of roasted venison hit her like a punch to the jaw. Saliva flooded Elara's mouth. It actually hurt. She clamped her teeth together, swallowing hard to keep her eyes from watering. Silver platters lined the long mahogany table, piled high with seared root vegetables and thick, crusty bread. Steam rose into the frigid draught of the room. She locked her gaze on the cracked stone floor. Breathe shallow. Stay invisible. Survive the hour. She perched on the very edge of her velvet chair, heels lifted, ready to sprint. Across the table, Kaelin hadn't spoken a single word since they left the study. The silence in the room was heavy, stifling. The only sound was the sharp scrape of his silver knife slicing against porcelain. He ate with slow, methodical precision. He was watching her. She could feel the weight of his stare, tracking the frantic rise and fall of her chest. Her fork clattered against her knuckles. The new, coarse wool dress they'd given her smelled of damp dust and mothballs. It blocked the worst of the draft, but the chills still gnawed at her bones. She scraped a tiny bite of potato onto her tongue. Butter and salt hit her taste buds. She swallowed it whole, fighting the violent urge to gorge. A starving stomach rejects a sudden feast. More importantly, her toddlers were currently freezing in the slum dirt. The reality of it twisted like a knife in her ribs. Miles away, in the pitch-black cold, her twins were huddled beneath a rotting canvas tarp. She had left them without a drop of water. I have to feed them tonight. Her pulse hammered against her eardrums. She peered through her eyelashes. Kalen wrapped his massive hand around a silver goblet. He lifted the dark wine to his mouth. For a fraction of a second, his focus drifted to the roaring hearth. Muscle memory took over. Her left hand darted out. She snatched a thick, warm roll from the nearest basket and shoved it deep into the hidden fold of her skirt. She instantly clamped both hands back around her fork. Cold sweat slicked her neck. A sudden scrape echoed from the courtyard window, claws dragging against the exterior stone. Her ex-mate's tracking hounds were already testing the perimeter wards. Her throat seized shut. Across the table, the silver knife halted. The room fell dead silent. Elara stopped breathing. She braced her shoulders, squeezing her eyes shut. She waited for the strike. Stealing from the warlord demanded a physical toll. No shout came. The table didn't flip. Kalen slowly set his knife down on the white linen. He didn't look up. His broad shoulders remained perfectly relaxed. Put it back on the plate. Her blood turned to ice. She pulled her trembling hand from her pocket. Slowly, she placed the stolen roll back onto the porcelain. The soft thud echoed loudly in the quiet hall. Kalen pushed his chair back. He tossed his napkin over his plate, turned his back, and strode toward the heavy double doors. He stopped in the threshold. He didn't look back. Eat it.
The oak doors clicked shut behind him. Kalen stood in the drafty corridor, his chest heaving. He pulled in a ragged breath. The wolf inside him was thrashing, demanding he tear the doors off the hinges and drag the starving woman directly into his hearth fire. It's her. The thought beat a steady rhythm against his skull. He leaned his shoulders against the freezing stone wall, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had drafted a strict, binding contract specifically to sever all emotional ties. A simple transaction to save his pack. Then he inhaled the scent of crushed pine. The fates had a sick sense of humor. He ground his molars together. He needed distance. If his beta scented even a drop of this weakness, she would tear the pack hierarchy apart. He had just caught his mate stealing from his own table. A warlord would have locked her in the dungeon. But watching her trembling knuckles hide that bread hadn't sparked anger. It sparked a suffocating wave of guilt. His own people had starved her. Down the hall, the dining room hinges groaned. Elara slipped through the gap. She didn't notice him standing in the shadows. She crossed her arms tightly over her ribs, tucking her chin as she hurried toward the lower quarters. Her teeth chattered audibly in the quiet corridor. Kalen watched the sharp, vulnerable jut of her spine. She hugged the wall, sticking to the darkest shadows. She looked incredibly fragile. He pushed off the stone. Reaching out, he pulled his thick, furred mantle directly from the armor stand. It was heavy, and it smelled like him. His boots struck the floorboards. Elara spun around, a sharp gasp tearing from her throat. Her eyes went wide. She scrambled backward, slamming her shoulder blades against the freezing wall. She threw her arms up over her head, waiting for the punishment. Kalen stopped right in front of her. He didn't speak. He just raised the heavy fur mantle and draped it gently across her trembling shoulders. The thick hide swallowed her shivers. Elara stared up at him, completely bewildered. He was breaking his own rules. It was the only compromise his wolf would allow. He gripped the edges of the fur, pulling it tight under her chin. His rough knuckles brushed the skin just below her left ear. His hand stopped. Hidden beneath her tangled hair was a raised, jagged scar. He remembered mapping that exact texture with his thumbs a decade ago in the dark. The physical proof hit him hard. He traced the edge of the scar with his thumb. "Who did this to you?" Elara violently flinched. She dropped into a crouch, throwing her hands over her head to shield herself from a blow. The reaction gutted him. She genuinely expected him to hit her. Kaelin stared at the cowering woman, bundled in his fur. Another man had broken her long before she ever reached his territory. He slowly knelt on the stone floor. He leaned in close to her ear. "I will mount his head on my gates."
Frost burns when it gets into the bone. The lower chambers smelled of wet earth and old copper. Elara pulled her knees tight against her chest, shivering on the slate floor. She buried her face in Kaelin's thick fur mantle. The heavy hide smelled like pine, but it couldn't stop the draft cutting under the door. Her teeth clicked together, a sharp, rhythmic sound in the dark. Outside, boots scraped against the stone. The iron hinges shrieked. Light hit the room. The beta female stood in the doorway, gripping a heavy wooden bucket. Elara pressed her back to the damp wall. The stone bit through her thin dress. She kept her breathing shallow, waiting. The beta stepped inside. She walked straight to the corner hearth, where 3 dry logs sat in the grate. Those logs were the only thing keeping Elara alive. Key special little thing. The beta tipped the bucket. Freezing black water hit the dry wood. The grate hissed. The puddle rushed across the slanted floorboards, soaking the hem of Elara's dress. The cold was instant. It felt like crushed glass against her bare ankles. She jerked her feet out of the water, biting her lip to keep quiet. The beta tossed the empty bucket onto the ruined logs. It cracked loud in the small room. "Just a womb." The other woman wiped her wet hands on her trousers. "You don't get a fire, you breed or you freeze. Honestly, freezing saves me the trouble of feeding you." Silence settled in the room, just the drip of water hitting the flooded grate. Elara didn't look up. Her eyes stung. If she fought back, she'd be exiled. If she was exiled, her former mate would find her. The twins would starve. She tasted copper, or she had bitten right through her lip. "I can starve," she thought. For them. Shifting her weight, she let her hips sink into the icy water to pull her legs tighter together. She dragged Kaelin's mantle over her head. The dark closed in. The beta scoffed, turned, and walked out. A minute passed, the dripping slowed. Then the door exploded, the heavy oak splintered inward. The crash echoed off the stone walls, raining dust onto the floor. Elara screamed, burying her head under her arms. A shadow filled the doorway. Kaelin. His chest heaved. Dust swirled around his massive frame. He didn't look at Elara. His eyes locked on the flooded hearth. Then they snapped to the beta in the hall. The air in the room went dead. "Sire." The beta took a step back. "I was just..." A low rumble started in Kaelin's chest. It vibrated through the floorboards. Elara clamped her hands over her mouth.
Kaelin smelled wet ash. The instinct to kill hit him fast and hard. He looked at the ruined wood, then down at the small shape huddled in the freezing puddle. The heavy pelt covered her completely. She was shaking. "Out." The word was quiet. The beta didn't hesitate. She scrambled over the broken door and bolted down the corridor. Her boots slipped on the stone in her rush to get away. Kaelin stood in the doorway. The contract in his head, the rules about keeping the transaction clinical and bloodless, dissolved. He heard a wet, ragged breath come from under the fur. Crossing the room, he didn't hesitate. He reached into the icy water and lifted her. Elara went completely rigid. She felt weightless, just sharp angles and hollow bones beneath the heavy hide. He carried her out. Ignoring the guards in the hall, he bypassed the lower levels entirely. He took the limestone stairs 2 at a time and kicked open the door to his own quarters. Heat hit them like a physical wall. A massive fire roared in the grate, casting long gold shadows across the velvet curtains and the wide bed. He set her down gently on the edge of the mattress. Elara instantly pulled her knees up. Her eyes darted around the room, tracking the door, the window, the hearth. "Stay." He kept his voice flat, calm. Turning his back to her, he approached the fire. A heavy iron pot hung over the flames. He grabbed a ceramic bowl and ladled out thick, steaming broth and chunks of seared meat. The smell of roasted bone marrow filled the hot room. When he turned around, Elara was staring at the bowl. Her eyes were wide, feral. He sat on the far edge of the mattress, leaving 3 feet of empty space between them. He held out the food. She snatched it from his grip. Ignoring the wooden spoon, she tipped the hot ceramic against her mouth. She swallowed the scalding broth in huge, desperate gulps. "Slow down." He watched the tendons in her neck strain. "You'll make yourself sick. There is more." She didn't stop. Broth spilled over her chin. A thick, dark drop ran down her pale skin. Kalen lifted his hand. He moved slowly. He just wanted to wipe the spill away, to show her he wasn't going to hurt her. His calloused thumb brushed her jaw. Elara dropped the bowl. The ceramic shattered on the woven rug. Hot broth splashed across Kalen's boots. Elara threw her arms over her head and curled into a tight ball against the headboard. She let out a sharp, high sound, a whimper. Kalen froze. His hand hung in the empty space between them. He understood. She wasn't bracing for a random strike. She was bracing for the price of the meal. Someone had fed her, and then they had beaten her. They used the warmth as a trap. Lowering his hand, his fingers curled inward until his knuckles ached. The timber popped in the fire behind him. He looked at the woman cowering against his bed frame. "I'll kill him." The words were barely a rasp in the quiet room. "I will hunt him down."
A mother can only leave her children in the dark for so long. Rain battered the castle walls. 3 in the morning, Kalen had finally left for the border patrols, draping a thick blanket over her shoulders before he walked out. The second the heavy iron door clicked shut, Elara shoved the wool aside. The Alpha's bed was just a warm cage. She slipped through the quiet corridors. Deep in her pocket, her fingers traced the splintered edges of a carved wooden horse. She had dug it out of the courtyard mud yesterday. She needed to see them. She needed to give it to them, and she needed to count their breaths. Sneaking past the sentries, she slipped through the iron gates. The rain instantly soaked through her thin dress. Mud sucked at her boots, making every step a heavy, exhausting effort. By the time she reached the outer slums, her teeth were chattering. The shacks smelled of wet ash and rot. A scraping sound echoed in the alley ahead. Elara froze. A stray dog, or one of her former mate's trackers. He had sworn to leave the twins bleeding in the snow. She gripped the wooden horse tighter. The shadows held knives, but the castle held an executioner. She pressed her back against the wet brickwork. The cellar was just beneath the ruined tavern. 10 paces, 5, almost there. A shadow detached from the wall. A massive hand clamped over her throat. The force slammed her backward into the brick. The air rushed from her lungs. "Who are you meeting?" Lightning flashed. Kaelin. Rain streamed down his face. His heavy leather forearm pressed against her collarbone, pinning her in place. "Are you passing maps to the scouts?" he demanded. Elara couldn't breathe, for her vision blurred. He would search the cellar. He would find them. Her rigid, unbreakable defiance, the armor that had kept her alive for 3 years, crumbled. Her knees gave out. As she slid down the wall, Kaelin released her throat. She hit the freezing mud. The wooden horse slipped from her fingers, splashing into the puddle at his boots. She pressed her forehead against the wet leather of his boots. "Kill me." She choked on the rainwater and her own tears. "I broke the rules. Just spare them." She waited for the blade. Instead, the man above her went completely still.
The rain washed away the smell of the slums. Kaelin stood in the downpour. He had tracked her through the storm, expecting a traitor. He was ready to kill a spy. He looked down at the woman in the mud. Then he saw the puddle. A carved wooden toy bobbed against his boot. Them. She was offering her life for children she had hidden inside his walls. The fury drained out of him, leaving a hollow ache in his chest. Kaelin dropped to his knees in the mud right in front of her. "Elara." He kept his voice low. "Look at me." She was shaking so hard her teeth clicked. Slowly, she lifted her head. Rain washed the mud from her pale face. He reached out, his own hands unsteady. He gripped her shoulders and pulled her up from the filthy ground. His thumb brushed a streak of mud from her cheek. "Who is in the cellar?" "My babies." She wiped her face with the back of a trembling hand. "They didn't cross your borders on purpose. I carried them." It hit him all at once. She had sold herself as a breeder just to feed her children. She had taken the beta's beatings and slept in the freezing water for them. The rain continued to wash away the grime. Kaelin saw the jagged scar beneath her ear. Then the wind shifted. He caught her scent underneath the wet wool and mud, crushed pine and rain. He stopped breathing, the masked woman from the festival. The desperate encounter against the timber wall 10 years ago. The ghost he had looked for ever since. She was right here. Elara flinched. "Please. You." Kaelin stared at her. The math clicked into place. The festival. The twins hiding in the cellar. The children weren't trespassers. Oh, they were his. He opened his mouth to speak. To tell her the running was over. A deafening brass horn cut through the rain. The eastern watchtower. A border breach. Kaelin closed his mouth. The rival pack had broken through the perimeter. Hell was at the gates, the exact second he found his family. He gripped the hilt of his sword. He looked down at the mother of his children. "Do not move."
It is a brutal thing to watch a savior turn back into a monster. Elara stood in the center of the war room. The storm outside had finally broken. Harsh morning light cut through the leaded glass, catching the dust suspended in the air. The chamber smelled of old paper and the sharp copper tang of sharpened iron. She tightly gripped the edges of the oversized linen tunic a maid had shoved at her. Just an hour ago, Kaelin had dropped to his knees in the freezing mud. He had brushed her cheek. She had almost trusted him. Then the war horns blew. In the chaos that followed, he dragged her back inside without a word. He didn't send guards to the rotting cellar. He didn't mention her children. He just rebuilt his iron wall. Kaelin sat behind the heavy oak table. His shoulders were rigid. His amber eyes held nothing but frost. The original ink contract sat perfectly centered on the dark wood. He tapped a calloused index finger against the parchment. A slow, steady rhythm. "Alpha," she whispered. Silence. She closed her mouth. The dismissal physically hurt. He was looking right through her, actively ignoring the mud, still clinging to his boots. "The terms of our agreement state you will remain in the inner keep," he said, staring at the paper. His voice was flat. "The outer slums are compromised. You will be relocated to the high tower." "The tower?" Panic spiked in her chest. "But my babies!" His fist hit the oak table. The loud crack made her flinch. "This is not a negotiation. You are pack property. You will do as you are told." He was terrified. He had shown a fatal weakness in the alleyway, and now he was burying it under cruelty to survive the impending war. But she couldn't afford to coddle his pride. Her toddlers were freezing. She took a step forward. "Please. They are alone. They are starving. If you lock me up, who feeds them?" Kaelin stood, draped in dark leather and heavy steel plating. His massive frame blocked out the morning sun entirely. "Guards," he barked. "Escort her to the tower. Lock the deadbolt. Do not let her out." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. He was leaving her children to die. Before the sentries could grab her arms, the heavy oak doors banged open. A border scout collapsed onto the woven rugs. He was clutching a ragged, bleeding tear across his ribs. The smell of wet earth and fresh blood instantly filled the room. "Sire," the scout coughed. "The western border is down." "Aye, they broke the tree line." The room went dead silent. Kaelin drew his broadsword. The steel hissed against the leather scabbard. He turned his back as the sentries grabbed Elara, dragging her toward the darkest, coldest part of the fortress.
A commander cannot afford a heart on the battlefield. Kaelin walked down the freezing corridor of the high tower. His heavy boots echoed against the stone. He held a rusted iron key in his right hand. The metal bit deeply into his palm, but he squeezed it tighter. He needed the physical pain to distract from the ache in his chest. If the rival warlord smelled her rain and pine scent on his armor, the enemy would know exactly how to break him. He had to be the unfeeling king. Love was a liability. He stopped at the heavy oak door at the end of the hall. He stared at the rusted keyhole. His own father had locked his mate in this exact room during a siege decades ago. The Mad King had swallowed the key and died in the mud, leaving her to rot in the dark. Kaelin was repeating the exact same sins. He forced the memory down. He couldn't send armed soldiers into the slums to extract the twins. It would broadcast to the invading army that a high-value target was hidden in the cellars. He had to leave his own children in the dark. The guilt felt like swallowing glass. He lifted the key. It slid into the rusted lock. He stopped. He wanted to kick the door in. He wanted to pull her against his chest plate, breathe in her scent, and promise to march into the slums himself. But the war horns were blowing. He would kill the enemy first. Then he would beg for her forgiveness. He turned his wrist. The heavy iron tumblers slammed into place with a loud clank. A sound tore through the heavy wood. It wasn't a sob. Elara unleashed a feral, throat-shredding scream. Fists pounded against the thick oak. "My babies." She hit the door again. "Kaelin, they're alone. Let me out." Kaelin stumbled backward. His shoulders hit the cold stone wall. He had locked her up to keep her safe. He had forgotten that a mother's greatest fear isn't dying. It's living while her children are in danger. He hadn't just caged her. He had recreated her worst nightmare. Boots pounded on the stairwell. His lead general appeared, armor caked in mud. "Sire." The general was out of breath. They breached the outer courtyard. They're at the front gate. Kaelin stared at the locked door. Elara was still screaming on the other side. He gripped his sword, turning his back on the sound to go fight the monsters at his gates.
Elara tasted copper. She slammed her bare fists against the thick oak door. Again. And again. The heavy wood didn't budge. Outside the rusted window grate, The morning sky was a bruised purple. The screech of clashing metal drifted up from the courtyard below. Men were dying in the mud. The battle had reached the inner keep. Her twins were down there. She was locked in a stone box. She paced the freezing floor. Her vision blurred with static. She clawed at the iron deadbolt, tearing her nails against the rusted metal. She screamed for help until her throat was raw. Nothing answered, but the winter wind. Then the deadbolt scraped open. Elara backed away, her shoulders hitting the cold stone wall. Was it Kaelin? The heavy door swung inward. It wasn't him. The beta female stood in the doorway. She wore no armor. Their mud stained the hem of her velvet gown. In her right hand, she held a rusted skinning knife. A slow smile stretched across her face. Looking for the alpha? The beta dragged the blade along the wooden doorframe. He's busy. Half his vanguard is bleeding out in the mud. Where are my babies? Elara demanded, exactly where they belong. The beta pointed the knife toward the window. I found them hiding under a tarp. I had the guards drag them out into the center of the courtyard. Elara stopped breathing. They're infants. Your old mate broke through the walls, the beta sneered. He wanted blood. I offered him your bastards for a ceasefire. He kills them in the snow, and he spares my men. Elara didn't think. She launched herself across the stone floor. She hit the other woman hard. They slammed into the hallway wall, and the knife clattered into the shadows. Elara didn't feel the stone slicing her bare knees. She grabbed the beta's hair and slammed her head backward. Call them off! The beta thrashed. She drove a fist into Elara's ribs and clawed at her face, leaving deep, bleeding scratches down her cheek. Elara punched her square in the jaw. Panic flashed in the beta's eyes. She brought her heavy boot up and kicked Elara squarely in the chest. The air rushed out of Elara's lungs. She tumbled backward onto the floorboards. The beta scrambled out into the hall, spitting blood. Rot! The oak door slammed shut. The iron deadbolt slid home with a heavy grind. Elara dragged herself up. She pulled at the handle, locked. The silence in the room pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. Then a sound cut through the draft, blowing past the window grate. And faint, but unmistakable. Her babies were crying. Elara let go of the door. She slowly turned toward the towering stained glass window at the far end of the room. The stained glass showed a quiet forest. To Elara, it was just something in her way. She walked to the window. 2 stories down, the courtyard was a slaughterhouse. Armor clashed. Blood stained the snow. Right in the center of the chaos, her twins were huddled together in the mud. They were clinging to each other, crying into the frost. A massive man was walking toward them, dragging a blood-soaked axe through the slush. Her former mate. Waiting for Kaelin meant they would die. Elara reached up and ripped the heavy velvet drapes down from the iron wall sconces. Dust filled the air. She wrapped the thick fabric tightly around her forearms and wrists, knotting it as fast as she could. The 2-story drop didn't matter. The glass didn't matter. She backed up until her shoulders hit the wooden door. She stared at the center of the window. I'm coming. She ran. Her bare feet slapped the stone. Pushing off the final block, she threw her arms over her face and launched herself at the glass. The window exploded. Thousands of colored shards rained into the winter sky. The crash echoed over the courtyard, drowning out the battle. The freezing wind hit her. She fell. The fighting below stopped. Her former mate looked up. Across the courtyard, near the broken gates, Kaelin lowered his sword. Colored glass showered the mud. Elara hit the ground. She landed hard in the frozen dirt, right between the towering man and her crying children. A sickening crack echoed from her left leg. The impact tore the velvet from her arms. Glass and ice sliced into her skin. The ringing in her ears faded, replaced by her own ragged breathing. Pain flared, sharp and blinding. She didn't stop. To dragging her ruined leg behind her, She pulled herself across the ice. She crawled over the toddlers. Wrapping her bleeding arms around them, she shielded their heads with her own broken body. Blood dripped from her chin into the snow. Unarmed. Broken. She stared up at her former mate, at the dripping iron edge of his axe. She didn't flinch. She pulled her lips back, baring her teeth. A low, primal snarl ripped from her throat. She locked eyes with him, waiting for the strike.
Kaelin stood in the ruined courtyard. The heavy iron gates lay in splinters across the snow. The freezing air smelled of burning pine and raw blood. He gripped the hilt of his broadsword, letting the red edge drip steadily onto the ice. 10 paces away stood the invading warlord. The massive man dragged a heavy iron axe through the slush. Thick, jagged scars crossed his arms and face. This was Elara's former captor, the man who had starved her and hunted her through the slums. Hand over the female. The invader spat onto the snow. Give me back my property, and my men will march away. Kaelin didn't lower his blade. He didn't speak. He possessed the strength to slaughter every man in this courtyard, and he fully intended to paint the snow red to keep the woman currently locked in his tower. Then, the heavy oak doors of the inner keep banged open. 2 of the Beta's sentries marched out into the freezing wind. They were dragging 2 small children by the collars of their oversized shirts. The toddlers thrashed, their bare feet stumbling over the icy rocks. Kaelin frowned. Sentries were dragging undocumented slum children directly into a war zone. Explain this, Kaelin demanded. Get them out of the mud. A diplomatic offering, sire. One sentry shoved the children forward. They crashed hard into the slush. The Beta found the Omega's hidden bastards. The invader wants blood. We are giving it to him. A loud, harsh laugh echoed across the courtyard. The little bastards. The invading warlord smiled. My hounds need fresh meat. Pack law demanded Kaelin look away. Strategy required him to let the enemy take the bait. In the mud, the tiny boy pushed himself up on his bruised hands. He wiped his bleeding nose with a freezing knuckle. Then, he tilted his chin up. He looked directly at Kaelin. Kaelin froze. His grip slipped on his broadsword. He wasn't looking at a stranger. He was staring directly into his own amber eyes. The boy had the exact square angle of his jaw. He had the same thick, dark hair. The wind shifted, blowing across the courtyard. Beneath a heavy stench of smoke and blood, Kaelin caught a scent. Fresh rain and crushed pine needles. His scent, Elara's scent, blended perfectly together. The 10 years of bitter isolation and perceived failure vanished. The curse was a lie. These weren't trespassing anomalies. These were his children. Kaelin's vision went red. The invading sovereign took a heavy stride forward, lifting his rusted iron axe toward the toddlers. Before Kaelin could raise his sword, the sky exploded. A deadly, brilliant storm of colored glass rained down from the high tower. A small shape plummeted from the sky, slamming into the ice exactly between Kaelin and his newly discovered bloodline. Silence dropped over the courtyard.
The impact knocked the world away. For 3 seconds, Elara felt absolutely nothing, just the cold ice against her cheek. Then the fire started. Blinding pain shot through her left leg. Her forearms were shredded, the velvet ripped away to expose deep, bleeding cuts from the glass. Get up. She forced her broken body to move. A wet gasp tore out of her throat. Blood dripped steadily from her chin, melting the pristine snow. Her vision spun, but she dragged herself forward. Her ruined left leg scraped uselessly behind her. She crawled over the screaming toddlers. Collapsing her shattered frame over their small backs, she buried their faces in the shredded wool of her dress. I have you. Her voice was a raw rasp. Don't look. The invading warlord stopped. He stared down at her bruised back. He lowered his axe an inch. Oh, you insane rat, he laughed. You broke your own legs just to die 5 minutes early? Elara ignored him. She ignored the axe. Gritting her teeth, she turned her head toward Kaelin. The Alpha stood 10 paces away. He was paralyzed, his broadsword hanging uselessly at his side. He was staring at her. Elara had no weapons. She had no army. She reached into the pocket of her shredded skirt with trembling, blood-slicked fingers. She pulled out the crumpled, dirty parchment, the breeding contract. Lifting her shaking arm, she threw the paper onto the ice. It slid across the snow and stopped right against the toe of Kaelin's heavy leather boot. Take it. Elara choked on the words. The wind howled across the silent courtyard. The transaction. Tears cut clean lines through the dirt and blood on her face. You needed a vessel. You needed an heir. I surrender. Lock me in the dark. Starve me. Take the new infant when it comes and never let me see it. She pressed her bleeding forehead against the ice. Just let them walk. Her chest heaved. Take my life to finalize the ink. Let my babies leave these gates. Honor the trade. She waited for his clinical nod. She expected the icy commander to pick up the bloody paper, calculate the odds, and agree to the exchange. Kaelin didn't look at the contract. He stared down at Elara. The cold distance in his eyes was completely gone. Slowly, he reached up to his throat. He didn't say a word. He unbuckled the thick leather straps of his heavy mantle. He pulled the massive, fur-lined garment off his shoulders. He let it drop. The heavy hide slammed into the snow, landing directly on top of the bloody contract. He buried the ink. He buried the rules. Kaelin stepped over the discarded coat. He tightened his grip on his broadsword. Walking slowly and deliberately, he stepped right past Elara to kill the men who had threatened his family.
The air in the courtyard went dead. Kaelin's boots crushed the compacted snow. He didn't look at the invading warlord. He walked right past Elara and the crying children. His eyes were locked on a single shadow edging toward the shattered gates. The beta female was trying to disappear against the stone wall. She had seen him drop his coat. She had seen his eyes. The game was over. Kaelin crossed the courtyard. Leaving? The beta gasped and spun around. Her back hit the freezing stone. Her hands shook violently. Sire! She swallowed hard. I was securing the perimeter. For you. The slaughter around them had stopped. Even the rival soldiers stood frozen in the mud. Kaelin didn't argue. He didn't yell. His hand shot out. He grabbed the beta by the throat, hoisting her off the ground with one arm. Her velvet slippers kicked at the empty air. You threw my children into the snow. His voice was a low, rough whisper. You put my mate in a cage. He let her look at him. He let her see exactly what she had woken up. Then he snapped his wrist. A sharp crack echoed across the silent courtyard. The beta went limp. Kaelin dropped her into the slush. He turned slowly. The invading warlord was still standing in the snow, his grip white-knuckled around his iron axe. Kaelin raised his left hand toward the battlements. 50 armored archers stepped up to the stone edge. The collective creak of stretching wood and tightening bowstrings filled the sky. 50 steel arrowheads pointed directly at the invader's chest. Get out of my territory. Kaelin's voice carried over the wind, cold and absolute. If you ever look at my family again, I will burn your forest to the ground. The invader dropped his axe. It hit the snow with a heavy thud. He took a stumbling step backward, then turned and ran for the broken gates. His men scrambled through the mud behind him. The courtyard was clear.
Elara lay in the bloody slush. White-hot pain radiated from her shattered leg. She kept her body curled over the crying twins, shielding them from the wind. She had just watched Kaelin kill the beta with his bare hands. She had watched him banish an army with a single sentence. Her throat was tight. The breeding contract was still buried under his coat in the snow. She was broken, useless. She closed her eyes, waiting for the order, waiting for his guards to take the babies and drag her back to the tower. Heavy boots crunched on the ice. He was walking toward her. She held her breath, tightening her arms around her toddlers. The footsteps stopped. A heavy metallic clank vibrated against the ground right in front of her. Elara opened her eyes. Kaelin wasn't towering over her. The ruthless sovereign of the north had dropped to his knees in the freezing mud. He ignored the blood soaking into his trousers. He ignored the dozens of warriors watching from the walls. Elara. His voice broke. He reached out. His hands were shaking. He didn't grab her. He gently cupped her dirty, freezing face. His calloused thumbs wiped the mud from her cheekbones. "I know who you are." He breathed the words out. "The rain, the pine, it's you." The heavy iron wall Elara had built around her chest finally cracked. A raw sob tore out of her throat. The rigid feral control she had used to survive the last 3 years vanished. She slumped forward, pressing her forehead against the cold steel of his chest plate. They were starving. She cried into his armor. "Ma, I just needed to feed them." "I know." Kaelin wrapped his massive arms around her shaking body. "I have you. You will never be hungry again." He shifted his grip, gently tilting her chin up. He looked at the pale skin of her neck, right where her pulse beat frantically beneath her scent gland. The contract strictly forbade marking. "Mine." He buried his face in the curve of her neck and bit down. Elara gasped. A sharp sting flared in her skin, instantly followed by a rush of intense liquid heat. The cold winter air faded. The terrifying emptiness in her chest was gone, replaced by his heavy, grounding presence. She closed her eyes and let the heat pull her under.
Kaelin slowly pulled back. He tasted copper on his lips. The bond snapped into place, heavy and permanent. He could feel her exhaustion. He could feel the dull, throbbing ache in her leg. But beneath it all, he felt her absolute relief. He looked down. The toddlers had stopped crying. They were staring up at him with wide, quiet eyes. The little boy reached out a dirt-streaked finger and tapped the cold steel of Kaelin's breastplate. Kaelin let out a rough, tired laugh. "Come here." He reached into the slush and scooped both children into his left arm. They weighed nothing. He held them tight against his chest to block the wind. He turned his attention back to his mate. Her leg was ruined. She couldn't walk. Reaching out, he grabbed his thick, fur-lined coat from the snow. He shook off the ice and wrapped the heavy hide tightly around Elara's shoulders. Sliding his right arm under her knees, he stood, lifting her effortlessly against his armor. He held his family. Kaelin turned to face his men. Dozens of hardened soldiers stood frozen in the ruined courtyard, staring at the king who had just permanently marked a woman from the slums. The lead general took a step forward. He dropped to one knee in the bloody snow and bowed his head. The rest of the courtyard followed. Armor clanked against the ice as every single warrior dropped to their knees in the mud. "Secure the perimeter." Kaelin's voice echoed off the stone. "Get the healers to my quarters." He walked. He carried them out of the blood and the frost. He carried them up the stone steps and through the heavy oak doors of the inner keep, and they stepped into the warmth. The fires were roaring in the hearths. The little boy buried his face against Kaelin's collarbone, already half asleep. Elara rested her cheek on his shoulder, her eyes finally closed. The heavy wooden doors boomed shut behind them. The winter was locked outside. Kaelin pulled his family closer, a low rumble starting deep in his chest as he walked down the hall.